Hello and welcome to Carnivorist Chats. My name is James, your host. I started this podcast to help other folks share their own healing stories and to interview thought leaders and experts in the carnivore, keto, and low oxalate space. Before we begin, I'd like to give a shout out to Equip Foods and the Carnivore Bar. As an affiliate, you can use the link in the show notes to get a discount on their products when you check out using the code Carnivorist. Thanks in advance for listening, subscribing, and any likes or shares. And now, on with the podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Carnivorist Chats. It's James, your host. We're back again for another episode, and I have a dear friend of mine joining me. Christi West has an amazing story to tell. From a Lyme diagnosis to trying carnivore to oxalate dumping, we share so much in our journeys, don't we, Christi? So I want to officially welcome you to Carnivorist Chats.
Thanks, James.
I just want the listeners to understand, and again, what I'll do is I'll put a link in the show notes for the wonderful interview you did with our dear friend Michael, and that's what I sort of listened to in preparation for our chat today. But what I'd like you to do, Christi, is if you could just share a little bit about your background, where you grew up, sort of what dietary choices and habits that you had, because I think we also share a lot of similarities in that as we were growing up through the years. So please let the listeners know.
So my name's Christi. I actually grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. Many people have heard of Loudoun County, so that's my home. I do currently live in Colorado Springs. We moved out here about 4 years ago, a little bit over. We actually grew up, we were homeschooled. I would say that my mom was semi-health conscious. I remember going to the chiropractor when we were kids. I remember her, trying to feed us somewhat healthy, but I do think being from an Italian and Irish background, there were high oxalate foods that were common in our diet, such as, regularly doing mashed potatoes or potato salad, a lot of like pasta, tomato sauce, whole grain breads, peanut butter, standard foods that you kind of grow up eating, chocolate for desserts or cakes and things like that. A lot of nuts, like my grandparents who, my grandfather was Italian and my grandmother was Czechoslovakian, so we'd visit with them. They always had, high oxalate nuts around. I mean, I think I probably grew up on somewhat of a standard diet. And then as I got a little, and I do remember actually as a kid, first of all, when I was 9, we were homeschooled. So when I was 9, I still wasn't able to read 3-letter words. So at 9, my mom had some really special testing done. I was diagnosed with only 9% short-term memory. 9% short-term memory. So I would read a 3-letter word, and when I get to that same word on the next page, it was like I was starting over every time. I also remember at one point, I don't remember my age, but I remember having knee pain for a couple of years. It didn't amount to much, but it would hurt, and I always thought that was strange. I did have a lot of ear infections as an infant, my mom said, which is a standard classic oxalate symptom. And so I even remember like my mom had some mood stuff and depression issues. So I personally think there's probably a lot of toxicity with oxalate in our family, as well as my dad being a diabetic and things like that. So I grew up, I guess eating somewhat of chicken, spinach, things like that, potatoes. And then as I got older, I got kind of conscious of my weight because I was always not a fat kid, but kind of solid. So I lost a lot of weight in high school. I don't really remember what I ate. And then as I got older, I got into the hair business. And then, 19 years old, I picked up smoking, partying a lot, and definitely thinking back, probably eating high oxalate foods. Working in the hair business, you'd be busy all day. You'd order French fries and gyro or whatever. You'd eat all the fries, Chipotle meals with a lot of black beans, things like that. So anyways, I think that was consistent with a lot of my diet. I got healthier when I got diagnosed with Lyme. I don't want to jump too far ahead. I did work with a holistic doctor who did have me on standard process, a lot of chocolate smoothies, spinach smoothies, things like that. But that was a little bit later on. So that's kind of the way we ate growing up, just kind of standard American food, but definitely high oxalate foods were wrapped into that.
Very interesting, Christi. Let me ask you, were you also part of, and please forgive me, I'm unsure of your age, but for me, I kind of hit that perfect timing for the low-fat revolution. Was that part of your household too?
I would think so, because I remember eating a lot of like chicken, you know what I mean? Chicken and like a broccoli or a spinach. It was, like I said, a lot of like whole grain bread. My mom would make bread too. Oddly, there's parts of my childhood I just don't remember. And I don't know if it's just trauma or if it's just an oxalate toxic brain. But I do specifically remember like my mom going to the health food store, and we see a chiropractor. And I think she tried her best to feed us somewhat healthy. But I still feel like looking back, like Thanksgiving, we'd all crush we did sweet potatoes a lot, and I remember that specifically at Thanksgiving, like marshmallows and sweet potatoes and walnuts and all those dishes, and a lot of potato salad we would do. My mom would make a really good potato salad and a lot of mashed potatoes and things like that. So there were definitely high oxalate foods, I would say, that were a regular part of our diet growing up. But yes, I think low fat. I don't remember eating, and I don't know if it was a money thing, but I don't remember eating a lot of steak. She would do like ground beef and stuff, but yeah, I think so.
Let me ask you two quick questions before we sort of move on to the next stages related to your childhood. When you mentioned a lot of ear infections, which I had as well as a kid, were you ever put on antibiotics back then for the ear infections, Christy?
She said I was, because over the years I've tried to like ask questions, but she did tell me that I had a lot of ear infections, which I would assume, knowing probably my mom, we would have taken an antibiotic for those. Yeah.
And at any time during your early stages of your life, did you follow a vegetarian, vegan, or light diet, or had you always eaten some sort of meat?
Yeah, always meat. I did try vegetarianism for about 6 months, and that's actually when I met my husband, Brian. We've been together for almost 20 years. So since I was about 19, and he was vegetarian and vegan for many years. So I tried it for 6 months, but I remember him always and he did eventually go back to eating meat, but I still remember him teasing me that I couldn't maintain a vegetarian diet. But there was always meat, whether it was ground beef and a pasta sauce or a chicken on the side. Like, we always had meat.
From listening to your story, Christy, obviously mine was because of a lot of my past dietary choices that included what I just asked you about, which was vegetarianism and veganism, which severely impacted my health. And later on found that most of those years for me were filled with high oxalate foods, which you can't help but get into on those styles of diets. So it was a combination of malnutrition and toxicities for me, which led to my steep decline in health. But for you, you mentioned that your health broke at 30. So lead us up to that age 30, and what happened, please?
I mean, at that time, Brian and I were young when we got married. I was 23. At the time, he was vegetarian. I don't think he was vegan. He was vegan before we met, but he was vegetarian for some years after we got together. Then we started adding in fish, meat. I guess we did eat some vegetarian options in my younger, 20s. And we partied a lot. We liked to drink, and smoke cigarettes and things like that. And at that time, looking back, I mean, I was definitely not eating real well. I look at pictures, I was inflamed. I did like chocolate. I was never loved dark chocolate, but I loved Reese's Pieces. I did hair, so we would order pizzas and eat those. We'd order, burgers and fries. I always loved French fries. I'd eat a whole side of French fries. So I think that I was eating a high oxalate junk food diet, to be quite honest with you. And I think for some reason, I just genuinely feel that I was probably hyper absorbing oxalate most of my life, whether it was antibiotic use as an infant or young child. I just have a feeling that I was absorbing more than I was supposed to be. Anyways, so we were married. I had Sebastian when I was 27. I had a C-section, and that all went great. I recovered fine from that. I didn't have any side effects. I never had to take painkillers afterwards. And then it was really with Dylan is when he was our second one, and I had him at 30. And I had scheduled and opted for another C-section because my doctor always told me that my hips were too small to deliver naturally. So I had a C-section with Dylan at 39 weeks, went in with minimal health problems. Looking back, there were some weird things that I was experiencing, such as if I bent down and stood up, my legs would go weak, like where I almost felt like I was going to fall, but I never did. I would get this stabbing pain in the center of my spine when I'd lay down at night, where it was almost like I couldn't take a breath. So there were little things kind of looking back over the years that seemed to kind of come about. And I don't know if it was oxalate, if it was a Lyme thing, if it was just a combination of things. And so I got pregnant with Dylan, opted to have a C-section, went in with minimal health problems, although I didn't really look well. I was fat and inflamed. I went in for the C-section, gave me, an epidural. And honestly, it was an awful experience. I could feel everything, so the epidural didn't work. And then they gave me so much Dilaudid because I was feeling everything through the C-section because the epidural wasn't really working. And I had blood in the catheter, so they couldn't give me any more epidural. So they pumped me with Dilaudid to the point where I was so out of it that Dylan was born at 9 and I didn't even see him till 2:30 in the afternoon because I was so out of it. And so I woke up from that, obviously not feeling great. And then as the days went on, I was in the hospital about 4 days. I was noticing that I wasn't feeling well. I was running a low-grade fever and I was having really bad body aches. So I thought it was my breast milk coming in, and it just never went away. And that was at 30. So that was December. Dylan's birthday is December 15th. So December of 2015.
Interesting. And the reason why I say all this is interesting, Christy, because as I mentioned to you, I listened to your podcast with Michael, and now listening to you as you tell your story. The listeners may or may not be aware that for many, many years, my parents have had a second home in Virginia, and I spent a lot of time up in the Blue Ridge Mountains there over the years. And what I didn't realize, and we're starting to get into as you start to hone in on the Lyme diagnosis, is that, as you mentioned, Loudoun County is a very high Lyme area. Anywhere that there's deers, there's going to be ticks pretty much, especially if you're in that climate. And through my own journey, they were going to test me for Lyme because a lot of the symptoms that I was displaying were consistent with a Lyme diagnosis. As it turns out, I had a bacterial infection, which was just as bad in my gut, which was Shigella, and then chronic Epstein-Barr virus. It was absolutely awful. Who was the first person to you, Christy, and it was probably your naturopath, that suggested to you that this could be Lyme coming to you?
Well, yes, you're right. I grew up in Loudoun County, and like I told you, we homeschool. So my mom, at the time I was born in 85, so I'm 38, I'll be 39 next year. And so, we spent much of our time besides homeschooling, like playing outside, running around, in the creeks and riding our bikes and in the woods. So it very well could have had a tick bite at some point and had a dormant virus or bacteria or something my body was maintaining really well for many years, you know what I mean? Until I think I just got too toxic that wasn't really symptomatic of that I know of. But yeah, so Lyme was a big deal. So basically I go in, have my C-section, end up with these really painful body aches and a low-grade fever that's sitting like about 99, 100. And it just didn't go away. Like my doctor was like, yeah, it's just your breast milk. You can have body aches and things. I always ended up with a ton of milk when I was pregnant. And so, like I said, I got home, but I was in so much pain in my body. Like the aching was so bad that I had like a whole bottle of ibuprofen, 60 milligrams a tablet. And I went through that in a matter of weeks because and I told you my first C-section, I had no problem. And then I started getting these like flu-like symptoms that would go on for about 12 hours. So I'd start to get really achy. I'd start to get hot sweats. I'd have heart palpitations, very achy, very painful. And then about 12 hours later, they'd clear up. So actually, because I lived in Loudoun County, I knew quite a few people who had dealt with Lyme or their kids had it really bad or whatever. So when these things started happening, I started to think like I might have Lyme. And so I went and saw an infectious disease doctor who basically told me I was crazy, and then started asking around some local people if they knew anybody that knew how to diagnose Lyme. So I found a primary care doctor. I remember going to her, and she tested me. She did the Western blot. So she tested me for all these co-infections and tested me for Lyme. Everything came back negative. But she tested my CD57, which she said is a quadrant of your white blood cells that's directly related to Lyme disease. And people with Lyme tend to have a very low count in that CD57 quadrant. So she ran my CD57, and sure enough, the healthy range is 200 and mine was 30. 30 is considered chronic Lyme disease. And I did some research on it myself too. And that's what they had found, like in the Lyme community, and especially doctors that were good at treating Lyme, that a range between 30 and 60 with your CD57 lands you in a chronic Lyme range.
What I'm thinking, I was just looking in the background here, Christy, interestingly, is that I had an aha moment when I was chatting to Giselle Bisson, who's the recovering vegan on Instagram. And what happened to her was that she had a severe trauma in her life that brought about a lot of things being released into her body. And I had an aha moment talking to her where I remembered, and I had forgot about this. When I was vegan, not only did I pass out giving blood once and fell down some stairs and gave myself a concussion, the scar's still here. How I didn't pull my eye out of the socket, the doctor was amazed, but I literally passed out as I was leaving the doctor's office, fell down the stairs. I had a severe concussion. And then the other thing was that I was involved in a rear-ending traffic accident in the United States when I was on holiday. And it was immediately after that that I really began to notice my health declining. And it was immediately after that that I started testing for things for like Lyme and the Epstein-Barr reactivation, which happened. Do you think ever that that could have been because of your C-sections, that it triggered something in you to release the Lyme? Is that what the doctor thought?
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, James, Sally actually talks about this a lot, about these traumatic events in our lives. It can be a physical event, it can be a surgery, pregnancy, that trigger chronic disease. And I think she says this, and it makes sense to me, that the body is all like because we don't necessarily have a ton of symptoms, we kind of are in this balancing act that we don't even realize our body's in. The body is in this act where it's dealing with all this toxicity and just keeping things from going haywire. And then you have a traumatic event and the body just cannot recover from that. It's just too much trauma. And that's exactly what happened to me. I mean, I wouldn't look back now and say, oh, I was a really healthy person, but I didn't have a ton of health problems that were affecting me. I did look fat, kind of. I did look inflamed. Like, I can look back and see that I didn't look really healthy, but I wasn't a sickly person. You know what I mean? And then I had the C-section and then everything went crazy. And to be honest with you, I think I both had infection and I also think that I was dumping oxalate, to be quite honest with you. And I think so many of those things can be intertwined and interconnected. Like Sally says, at 4 years, 4 years of low oxalate, that she ended up with a reactivation of Epstein-Barr and Lyme disease that she had to treat. And she honestly believes that those infections and those crystals go hand in hand.
Absolutely. At the exact same time that I had that trauma, I was bombing myself with the highest oxalate foods possible. And this is a couple of years into that diet. So I was already oxalate toxic from years past, plus the vegan diet, which was really bombing myself. What I wanted to just touch on quickly before we dive into what you did next on your journey, Christy, when you found out this diagnosis, was obviously my GP had asked me and said, we're testing for everything. I was a human pincushion during my sickest years. I literally was giving blood every week to figure out what the heck was going on with me, which I later found out was obviously related to my diet and the ability to absorb foods and it being oxalate toxic. But one of the things, hearing your symptoms, and we have so much similarity on our journeys, Christy, is this Lyme thing. And the reason why is because when I went to my doctor and I talked to her, I said, well, this is what I'm experiencing. Similarly to you, a lot of things. And there are co-infections with Lyme that people don't talk about. They think there's just Lyme, but there's also Bartonella and there's Babesia. And babesiosis had all the ticks of the box for me. So some of the things that people that have babesiosis are high fever, especially night sweats, which I know you had, fatigue, which I had, chills, neurological dizziness, feeling spacey, that's me, headaches, migraines all the time, lymph gland swelling, mine was awful, spleen and or liver enlargement, I felt that too, lab abnormalities, which may include low white blood count, low platelet counts, psychiatric anxiety, panic attacks, palpitation, muscle pains, and here's the one which I know you and I shared, which I could not figure out what the heck was going on, and that is air hunger, which is unique to Babesia as well. I wondered if you had ever thought about that, and specifically prior to oxalates.
I had never, so my big symptoms after my C-section, and I'd say after my body kind of went haywire, were severe joint swelling and pain that would bounce around. So that came on a little bit farther down the road. And I honestly noticed some of that start when the primary care doctor started to treat me with doxycycline and antivirals, because some of the symptoms I was having, the heart palpitation, the fevers, the body sweats, the body aches, like these weird flu-like symptoms that would come on in the middle of the night that would go for about, she thought was Babesia. So she had me on antivirals and doxycycline. It really wasn't getting better. So those were kind of my starting symptoms, and I would get really bad, like from my waist down, I would get severe body aches. And then as I progressed, so this is like in the 2016 range when I'm still trying to figure stuff out, I started to get swelling really bad, where my knees would swell and I couldn't put weight on it, or like not my knees, but yeah, like my knees, like my joints, and then wrists, elbows, things like that. The air hunger and all of those things never came on till I went carnivore. So I never experienced any breathing problems or anything like that. And so I treated traditionally with the with my primary care doctor for about 6 months, but I wasn't getting better. I felt like I was getting worse. And that's when, probably about, I don't know, mid 2016, if I remember correctly, I decided, and I had started taking some herbs, and because I wasn't getting better, I wanted to get a second opinion. So I went into DC to Dr. Jemsick's clinic, and he's a well-known Lyme specialist. And I met with them for a 3-hour appointment. They looked at all my lab work. They were like, you definitely have Lyme disease. But what she wanted to do was a 3-year high dose protocol of antibiotics. And at that time, I was taking herbs and things like that. I was herxing really badly. And I went home from that appointment, and for about 3 nights, I had really bad dreams about taking those antibiotics, to be honest with you. So I called them back, and I told them I needed to cancel my follow-up appointment. And that's when I went on a quest, and I decided, all right, I have 3 problems. 1 is lack of nutrition, 2 is toxicity, and 3 is a gut that is just not healthy. And if I can work on these 3 things, then I should be able to work myself out of this mess. That was the start of about 2017.
I guess my next question is for you is, you're taking matters into your own hand, which I did. I didn't have a choice at the time because it was locked down, and I was listening to podcasts and trying to figure out what the heck I can do. I'd lost my job. I didn't have health insurance. So I was listening to any hope that I could get, which is why I'm doing something like this today to get people hope. So what did you do? What did you do next?
Well, the first thing I did was I stopped taking everything. I stopped taking herbs. I stopped taking antibiotics. I stopped taking antivirals. And I said, okay, I'm going to take a ton of Juice Plus. I'm going to get on the Weston A price diet. And I started taking very high doses of vitamin C. Because, and I will say this about vitamin C, I am in total agreement, because I was probably taking anywhere from 10 grams upwards of 100, depending on the day and how well I could handle it bowel tolerance wise. Only thing I'll say is that I genuinely think that the vitamin C did help me with some of those infections, because I assume I was herxing at the time. So I started Juice Plus, which actually from some of my research can be on the higher oxalate. I was taking handfuls of that. I was doing Weston A price, and then started taking high doses of vitamin C. And I remember, and Lipo-C. So because I was reading that it was great. It helped get rid of Epstein-Barr. It helps get rid of Lyme disease and all these things. And I actually remember the very last episode of that flu-like thing that would hit me late in the evenings, where I'd get a hot fever, the sweating, the body aches, the heart palpitations. I remember very specifically the last time I had that, and I started taking the Lipo-C, and it was like, I don't know, I just knew that like I had the last bout of it. And sure enough, that was years ago. And so while I don't think high dosing vitamin C is a good idea, and if I could go back, I probably wouldn't have done that, but I actually do think it helped with some of that infection that I was contending with. So I did that for a while, but my biggest problem has been, and to this day I still contend with to some extent, is these heart palpitations, which came on after Dylan was born, and they have been pretty consistent in my life Dylan will be 8 next month. And it didn't matter. It doesn't matter what I've done. Like, I did supplements, I took minerals, I took electrolytes, and I started seeing this holistic muscle chiropractor, muscle testing doctor. She had me on standard process. She had me on smoothies and spinach and all this stuff. And I was also still doing the high oxalate stuff. And while I had stuff clear up, I did. Like, my joints have never flared again. Those infections that I was having at night where I felt like I had the flu, that went away. But these heart palpitations, even just started my 5th year, I'm 4 years and 2 months into carnivore, and I still get them. And they're not as bad, and I have really peaceful times, but they still flare. And that is really that. Okay, so I worked with Dr. Bartlett for a year and a half. I saw improvements, but I never got 100% better. And then we packed up and moved out to Colorado, summer of 2019. And I came out here, and I kind of lightened up on my diet because we were traveling. So I was eating pizza, and I kind of had some donuts and just things I hadn't done in a long time. And I noticed my heart palpitations started to get worse again. my legs were hurting again and my skin started to itch. And I guess we moved out here in July, I think. Yeah, it's the month of July. So at the beginning of August, I decided I'm going to go carnivore-ish because I had tried it in 2018, but my naturopath, who was doing muscle testing, told me I needed more green vegetables in my diet and I needed to add spinach back in. So I started that back up. So it wasn't till 2019 that I tried carnivore again. And first we had moved out here, it's high altitude. So August, as soon as I cut everything out and started doing like a light carnivore, and I was like, I'm going to still do ice cream and have some wine though. And so I go carnivore in August and instantly I get the air hunger, instantly. And I'm like, I wake up one morning, go downstairs to make a cup of coffee, and I can't get a deep breath and it would not let up. And so I go to the urgent care hospital here in Colorado and I'm like, I can't get a deep breath. She checks my oxygen, everything's normal. She's like, if it continues, let me know. And I'm assuming it's just the high altitude because I wasn't used to it. So then I'm like, screw this. I'm going to give my body time to adapt to the altitude. I'm not eating like this anymore. I assumed it was the diet and altitude, not knowing anything about oxalate. And I go back to my normal diet. And within about 3 days, it was gone. For me, the air hunger came on with the reduction of oxalate in my diet. I will say when I tried carnivore, I tried it for 3 months in 2018 because of the heart palpitations and because nothing else I was doing was working. Eating healthier, doing supplements, all these things. I still had the heart palpitation, but I was still on some high oxalate stuff. I was still taking a lot of Juice Plus at the time. I was still taking a lot of standard processed supplements. I was still on their green supplement and some things like that. So even when I was doing carnivore back in Virginia in 2018, and I only did it for 3 months, I still had oxalate in my diet. I was maybe even still doing some tea. It really wasn't until I came out here and really did the carnivore with no supplements or anything that the dumping really came on. But yeah, so 2018, I did a short stint of it, but my doctor, my naturopath said I needed more green vegetables. So I went back to, spinach and things like that. We loved rhubarb, so I would make rhubarb. And then I tried it in August of 2019 when we first moved out here because my heart palpitations, my legs were hurting, my skin was itching. And instantly I started with the air hunger. But as soon as I went back to eating normal, the air hunger went away. And then I went full-fledged, hardcore carnivore end of September 2019. And I've been carnivore since.
A couple of things, Christi, and thank you for sharing that. Super interesting. What I wanted to ask you about is that when I listened to your podcast with Michael, you tried a raw milk fast for a little while initially. How did that come about? I'll let you answer that one first.
Okay, so that's a great point. Now looking back on that, I know I was oxalate dumping when I did that because, okay, so this was in the process of like, I'm done with antibiotics and stuff. I'm going to recover my own health. I'm going to work on cleaning up my gut. So I started just reading online and I came across this lady who had tried like an egg diet, a raw egg diet and all these things. She was dying with Lyme disease and she came across the raw milk cure that they were doing back in the 1800s, where they were treating people with cancer and tuberculosis and all these diseases. They were feeding them a raw milk diet. You were doing 8 ounces. I think you did 8 ounces of raw milk every, was it hour or so much, and putting them out in the sun. So she starts doing this raw milk diet and she starts healing. Her weight, her hair's growing back, putting weight back on. And she did it for, I think, about 3 months. And I think the raw milk cure, there's an old book you can read about that, talks about like the time frame. So I did do a 3-month raw milk fast and I was doing probably 8 ounces of raw milk every day. And I did it strictly for 3 months. And I can tell you now, I thought it was the kefir. We were making homemade kefir. I thought I was like herxing from the stuff in my stomach from the raw milk kefir, but now I think I was absolutely oxalate dumping. I was detoxing so bad I would get up in the morning and I couldn't even stand because I was so dizzy. So, I made it through the 3 months. I'm very tough. Like I did the herxing stuff. I know what detox can feel like. And I've just pushed through it, maybe wisely, maybe unwisely. I don't know, but time will tell, I suppose. So yeah, I did that for 3 months, but I think I was looking back severely dumping on the raw milk fast.
Very, very interesting. My listeners know that I wanted to get dairy in my diet because I learned about how it can help bind oxalates through the gut is on this way out, but I struggled to be able to reintroduce dairy, especially kefir. I had to go with little sips. Now I can drink, thankfully, as much as I want. I absolutely love it now. And having dairy back in my diet has been very beneficial for me to put back on weight. One thing I wanted to ask you about, Christi, is because some listeners may not understand this. What do you mean when you say you go to a naturopath and you talk about muscle testing? What exactly is muscle testing and what does it mean?
Yeah, so it's like an energy testing. It's called kinesiology, I believe. So Dr. Bartlett I did love her. She was a wonderful lady, anti-vaxxer, all those things. Like, I loved her. And I was learning a lot about toxicity and health at that time because I was really digging in because I wanted to get better. And so, and she was a wonderful lady, but she was a chiropractor. She sold standard process supplements, and she also was trained in kinesiology, which allows you to use points in the body and basically let the body tell you what it needs through like being reactive towards things. So, and I still use it sometimes. Like, you can hold something up to your chest and just ask yourself, like, is this something you want? And you just relax, and the body will either move towards it or away from it. So if you move away from that object, that means the body doesn't want it. If you move towards it, it means that it's something so the body wants. So it's a little more probably, I don't know, the way she did it was a little different than that. But basically putting supplements on your chest and different things, and then pushing down at different parts of the body, and the body will say, like, this is something I want, or this is something I don't want. So all of her supplement recommendations were done based off muscle testing. And so she was able to tell me, these are the things you need in order to support your body and to recover your body. So I think that's probably an okay explanation of it.
Absolutely. Interestingly enough, where I first heard about muscle testing was through a chiropractor I had been seeing at the time, and then following Dr. Klinghardt, who is one of the leading Lyme specialists in the whole US, who has the Sophia Institute out in Seattle. And I learned about muscle testing and how he would muscle test on folks to figure out Lyme diagnosis as well, which was really interesting.
Yeah, and Dr. Bartlett was able to test me for Lyme, and my Lyme was concentrated. And here's the other thing, and the reason why I think a lot of my heart stuff had more to do with oxalate. She tested my heart multiple times to see, because like I told you, I've dealt with these stupid palpitations for years. And like I said, I think they're improving, but I also know oxalate issues, dumping, all those things can trigger irritation in the heart and in the electrical mechanisms of the heart, and depletes the body of stuff. So she muscle tested me for Lyme, and mine was concentrated in the liver, to be honest with you, from what she tested. And on top of that, and I know who Dr. Kleinhardt is because I think his article was the article I read when I was trying to figure out my white blood cell count and what that aligned with as far as where I was in chronic Lyme disease. And I think his article talked about 30 to 60 is considered chronic for the CD57. But anyways, so she said that my Lyme was concentrated in my liver, and eventually I think got to a point where I wasn't testing for it anymore. And on top of that, my heart always tested fine. Always. She'd always I was like, can you test my heart for Lyme? She's like, your heart is fine, but I have these palpitations. So I never had Lyme in my heart, or other things, even though it seemed like I was just always contending with heart palpitations.
Yeah, the palpitations that were a big thing for me. Luckily, I don't have those anymore. I'm very thankful for at least that being gone predominantly, amongst a ton of other things. So I'm very, very grateful. But the heart palps were definitely bad, because when you get the palpitations, it perpetuates anxiety because you're thinking, are you having a heart attack? What's going on? Your heart won't slow down. So it was constant state of flight or fight for me, just as I'm sure we'll get to with you. And we'll talk a bit about the anxiety side in a little bit. Sure. Now, Christi, for the listeners, they know my story. I was very, very sick, as I mentioned to you, basically lying in bed, listening to podcasts, trying to figure a way back to health. And I came across a presentation by Sally, Lost Seasonality and the Overconsumption of Plants. I remember it to this day, watched it, and just was in awe that plants could actually harm you, which caused my deep dive into oxalates and then the carnivore diet. How did you come across? Because like me, you were like, what the heck is an oxalate? What did you do? How did you do? And what did you deep dive to?
Had you ever heard about oxalate poisoning?
Nope.
I never had heard that. It's just tragic. So many years of my life, I feel like I've spent trying to recover. And I do see things getting better, but just the fact that it's such a long road. So like I told you, I moved out to Colorado. I started to have heart palpitations more frequently, my skin started to itch, and I started to have pain in my legs again. So August of 2019, I tried the kind of like a light carnivore, and I instantly get air hunger. And I'm like, what is that? I'm assuming it's the altitude. Even though I had been here for a month and not had any breathing problems, all of a sudden out of nowhere, I changed my diet and now I've got air hunger. So I go to the emergency room, they check me, my air is fine. Even though I couldn't get a deep breath, my oxygen level was fine, especially for like having never been used to high altitude. I think my oxygen was about 95 or 96, like, which they said was pretty normal for high altitude. So I get back home and I'm like, I'm just gonna go back to eating normal. I'm gonna let my body adapt to this crap, to this high altitude crap. And I'll think about trying this down the road. So within 3 days of going back to, I guess, somewhat eating normal, the air hunger vanishes. And I don't exactly remember, but I was kind of at a crossroads in like September of 2019, still dealing with some of these issues. I had all these supplements I was just tired of taking, handfuls of standard process supplements that only seemed to get me so far with my health. And obviously still having things that were lingering that were not resolving. So I actually just prayed in my kitchen and I just asked the Lord to please show me what the next step was for me. And it sounds so crazy. Maybe it is, but I was standing at my kitchen and I just felt in my spirit, get back on the carnivore diet. And honestly, that's probably the biggest reason I'm still on it with all this oxalate dumping, is because I genuinely felt a higher power came in and was like, this is the next step. I threw all my supplements out and I started carnivore. I had a decent 2 weeks on it. And then I just started having all these things happening to me that I had never had before, James. I had never had them with Lyme disease. I never had them before I had Lyme disease. You know, I started having dizzy spells. I was having chronic diarrhea, and that did last for almost a year and a half. I didn't have a solid stool until I hit 1 year carnivore. And diarrhea, and I can't even, worse palpitations than even before I went carnivore. I was taking minerals, and then I remember it like it was clockwork. 4 months on carnivore, didn't have any air hunger. 4 months on carnivore. February 5th, I woke up and that damn air hunger was back. And I could not get a deep breath. And we had just gotten over being sick with something, and that was right as COVID was starting, so early 2020. So I went to the doctor again. She gave me a albuterol, checked my oxygen, listened to my lungs. Your lungs sound great, they're clear, and your oxygen's normal. And I contended with severe air hunger for a solid 2 years. And then at about 2.5 years, actually after having COVID a second time, a major decrease in the air hunger. And it's gradually gotten better actually over time. And it was the air hunger in February of 2020, 4 months into carnivore, that drove me to start looking at what could be going on. And because I had dealt with the herxing of Lyme disease, and I knew that I felt that my body was detoxing, but I just didn't know what. So I started having all these symptoms of things that I had never had. I never had gut issues. I mean, I didn't eat well, but I never had constipation problems. I never had stomach problems, nothing. Never had air hunger. I never even had asthma. Like my whole life, I played sports, I played soccer. I never had bronchitis. I'd never had pneumonia, nothing. And all of a sudden, one simple change, and now I've got air hunger. And so many things. I don't know. I mean, so many, I have lists, blurred vision, where I thought I was losing my vision. I never had vision. I've never even needed glasses. And now I'm eating a carnivore diet. I'm eating healthier. I've gotten rid of the crap in my diet, and my vision was so bad. Like I thought I was going blind. And, as I've progressed, crystals, I mean, this morning I woke up and I had crystals dried all over my eyes, burning poop, burning pee, still to this day. I'll pee in a glass cup because I like to track it, and it is so clouded that I can't see through it. Still, I'm now in a 5th year of carnivore. So all these things started happening to me that I had never even had happen with Lyme disease or before. So it drove me down the road to start saying, like, what is this? What is this? I'm reading in the carnivore groups, people's breathing gets better. And now I can't get a deep breath. And all I've done was change my diet. And I came across this very short YouTube video where this Asian girl is talking about oxalate dumping and the symptoms. And one of those was air hunger. And when I figured that out, it led me to Sally, or actually it may have even led me to the Triangle Oxalate group first. I got in there and I start reading through the symptoms of oxalate dumping, and I'm like, oh my God, everything that's happening to me lines up with these oxalate dumping symptoms. And that's the only thing I've changed. I'm not even taking supplements anymore. I've just cut out oxalate. And so I'm stubborn and I've never added oxalate back in. And then I started finding Sally's videos, and I've probably listened to those at least once a week for years. And I've seen things get better. I'm still dealing with things, and I feel like much with oxalate toxicity and where it's been stored, as you progress, like stuff comes up that was not a problem before, but it shows you, I think, where those toxicities are built up. So that's going carnivore, and especially the air hunger is really what drove me into trying to figure out like what is happening to me. Now, should I have stayed carnivore? I guess time will tell, but I've stayed consistent because I felt like I was led down this road. And there's people that go slow to lower their oxalate that are dumping badly. So it's like, it's a gamble. And I feel like if I wasn't handling oxalate well most of my life, it's really not something that I want to add back in, even if the dumping is challenging.
This needs to be talked about even further. You mentioned it on Michael's podcast, but just the combination of the carnivore diet and those that are oxalate toxic, and what happens to those folks that join, because so many folks just have that everything, life is better. But if you don't, and especially for you and I, Christi, where we're coming from a background that includes either a severe bacterial infection like Lyme, as I had Shigella, a viral infection, when you change that microbiome, and what happened to me was, all hell broke loose. For me, it was a little bit longer. It was like 3 months, but I felt really, really bad, to the point where the listeners know I messaged Sally on Instagram and said, help, what's going on? And she's like, oh, what are you doing there? Slow down. You have gone too fast, too quickly lowered your oxalate level. So I chose to add back in some fruits. I swore down I'd never touch vegetables again, which I really have not, because of all the pain they caused me, Christi. It needs to be discussed a little bit further, because again, like you, it's so hard for me to wrap my mind around adding something back in that had done so much damage to me. And like you, I am thankful that I had gone through enough herxing on protocols in the past as a vegan, because I went on a very, very strong herbal protocol, which was a lot of tinctures, a lot of pills. I did high dose vitamin C as well, like you. And so I'm familiar with herxing, and herxing is a very, very real thing.
It's scary.
Very scary, because you don't know when it's going to stop, if it's going to get worse. Or you think to yourself, oh my goodness, I feel so bad today. This possibly can't get worse. Guess what? It can, and sometimes it does. Christi, what is, as we talk about dumping, you mentioned some of the symptoms now. What for you now is the telltale sign that you're about to go into a dump, and what happens?
I guess I feel like I must have I genuinely feel like I must have had so much oxalate in my body. Like, I don't know. So I guess things that I want to say that I do see improvements, although there's other things where I'm like, oh, geez. I would say I have not had reoccurrence in my joints, which I think I dealt with before I went carnivore, but I've not had any of that. My energy since I went carnivore is very good. And I'd say 95% of the time I sleep very well on carnivore. I do drink milk, so I drink a fair amount. I'm not doing raw right now, but I do get fresh, whole, extra fatty milk, and I get it from our rancher. It is pasteurized, but it's always fresh from their cows. So currently I'm doing that, and I do a fair amount of whole milk. I do some cheeses. I do chicken, like I love making a chicken salad. The carnivore though, I mean, I will use some avocado mayo, but that's about it. I will use a little bit of spice here and there. Pork we do, beef we do. So I try to keep a variety in my diet. I've not added back any fruit, and I've not added back any vegetables. If I felt like I really had to, I'm not opposed to it. If I get to a point where I feel like I just can't manage the dumping, I'm 2 months and 4 years in. And so I've seen some of my dumping symptoms come and go. So I've had dumping symptoms that'll come on and then they go away and I never have them again. And then I've had other things that tend to just be persistent. And I don't, whether it's one of the ways my body's excreting oxalate or it's an area that was affected and there's oxalate built up there. So my sleep is good. My energy is pretty good and always has been. Fatigue has not been a big problem for me. But things like I lost a lot of weight the first 2 years of carnivore. And then at about 2 years, I've put on weight. So I've put on all the weight I lost. I was down to about 120. I've put back on. So I'm sitting at about 140 or 160 right now, which is definitely heavier than I like. My air hunger has gotten a lot better. I still get bouts of it if I'm dumping, and it's not horrific when it comes on. So I still will get bouts of it, but it's not unbearable. I cannot work out. I mean, even a nice long brisk walk sometimes will put me in bed with nausea and dumping symptoms. So unfortunately, I'm not as active as I'd like to be at some point. And chiropractic, anything like that, I cannot do. The last time that I thought I was doing better and I started doing chiropractic again, had me in about a 6-month dump that really was quite challenging. And so there's just certain limitations I have. So the other thing that's, at like right about that 4-year mark, I just had some new stuff. And that's kind of how it's been with dumping for me. Like I've had some consistent things. And then at certain points, it's like just something new happens. And I'm like, oh, here we go. So for me, honestly, like since about August, which was just about my 4-year mark, I started having some vertigo episodes, some bladder burning and things like that, which I'd never had in 4 years. And that's not been chronic. That is actually was just for about a month, and it was on and off, and it's been gone. I haven't dealt with that. It was just a very short period of time. Muscle weakness. I haven't been able to work out because of the dumping, not because of weakness, just because it makes me clear oxalate too heavily. I noticed at about the 2-year mark, it's like I had my period, and my periods always trigger dumping for me. And I just came on with these new symptoms, like these short bursts of vertigo, which I'd never had in 4 years. I've had dizziness and stuff from dumping, but not vertigo. The burning bladder, really uncomfortable, burning pee, and then muscle weakness, which was a big thing for me. And I'd never had that. And it was literally like, my legs were weak, and I had some weird die off. I cleared some parasites on my own without taking anything. And that caused some neurological stuff in my fine motor skills, where I was sitting at work one day and I was having a hard time writing. And that was really, and I went to the bathroom and I was clearing parasites. So I don't always think it's just oxalate. I know oxalate can tie in with heavy metals and other things like that too. And then these short bursts of vertigo are a newer thing for me. And so I've actually been like, maybe I need some tea or something. So it's just weird, like how I posted in the Triangle Oxalate Carnivore group, and other people were saying, I'm in year 5 and I'm still having some difficult symptoms of dumping. And so I've seen things get better. This is really cool though. The first 2 years of carnivore, I was sick every 3 months, which was not normal for me. I'm thinking I'm eating carnivore. I should be doing better. I should be healthier. People eat carnivore and they don't get sick. Every 3 months, the first 2 years. Last year was my 3rd year. I got sick twice. And this is the first year that I've gone a whole year and hardly been sick with anything. Even my son Dylan had strep throat recently and kissed me on the mouth, and I did not catch it. So I see things getting better. And Sally talks about years 3 through 6 being a challenging time with challenging symptoms because it's older oxalate and it's deeper oxalate that's being cleaned out. So she said, you can experience challenging times because you've already experienced your first couple of years, and now you're in these later years and you're dealing with some difficult symptoms. Mine come and go, so it's not all the time. I'll have 2 weeks where I feel really good, and then bam, I get hit with dumping symptoms. And I feel like that's a little traumatic too, especially when you're like, oh, I'm feeling better, and then you're not feeling better. So I've seen things heal. I'm still in the throes of dumping with some difficult symptoms. And I just kind of take it day by day. If I can handle it, I can still somewhat live my life. I'm going to push through it. If it gets to a point where I feel like it's really enabling my ability to live my life, then I would consider maybe adding some oxalate back in. But even that's a gamble. I know people that have added 200, milligrams of oxalate back in, and it's not necessarily helping. So how high do you have to go to calm that? I don't know. So there's so many. I feel like you get kind of in this place where I'm like, I love eating carnivore. I think my body really likes it, but I feel like I'm in the throes of dumping, and there's really no guarantee that adding a bunch of oxalate will help. Will it make me worse? How much do I have to add in order to negate some of the dumping symptoms? There's just a lot of variables, and I feel like sometimes that's kind of overwhelming. But I see things healing, but I'm still dealing with some difficult symptoms that I think are oxalate related for sure.
Completely understand. This journey is so nuanced and individual for so many people. I'm sure there's folks out there that are going to listen to this podcast that say to themselves, I'm on Christi's side. This is what I want to do for myself. How do you augment the dumping? What do you do by not eating any oxalates? Are there things that you take or do that help you? How do you do it?
Honestly, I try to keep a mixed carnivore diet. So I do yogurt, I eat yogurt, I eat a mix of meat, and I honestly drink milk. I don't feel like I've had very uncomfortable episodes of dumping at this point, and it's not a prideful thing, but I don't feel like I've been in a position where I've been bedridden from dumping, but I do know people that were. I have had episodes of dumping where I might lay in bed on a Saturday because I just, but then I start to feel better the next day. I just tried to remind myself that I'm toxic, that I think that's been my biggest issue. And I don't know. I've just tried to push through. I have tried supplementing, but I tend to feel like it causes me to just really start to clear oxalate too heavily. And so that's why I drink a lot of whole milk, because it does have a lot of B vitamins. It's got a lot of calcium. It's got a lot of potassium. And I try to eat a varied diet of meat, but I have not added supplements back in. I've tried to do lime juice, but the last time I did that, and I was doing about a teaspoon a day with salt, within a week, I had a very severe episode of clearing. And I definitely felt like that was related to the lemon juice, because I know that it's recommended, but I've also read in the triangle oxalate group that it can also cause additional clearing because it softens up the oxalate, allows the body to clear it easier. So it, for some people, can induce the oxalate clearing. So before going carnivore, I was able to take supplements. I didn't have adverse effects from them. I don't think I have adverse effects to them now. I think it just gives my body more energy to be able to clear out more oxalate. So I have just avoided that. And I know oxalate clearing, it does affect the metabolism and how it manages what's coming into it. So I don't know. I just try to push through stuff, and I'm thankful that I'm in a place now where things kind of come and go. So it's not a constant dumping. I might have dumping for a few days and then I have a couple good weeks. So I think that helps in some ways, but I don't know if that's the best thing to do. And I don't think I would necessarily recommend that to somebody that's struggling with dumping and has gone carnivore. I think slower and steady is probably better. I just feel like I got really into carnivore and I'm kind of far into it now that I've just maintained. But I think if someone's really sick and not functioning and stuff, it probably would be best to add some oxalate back in and go really slowly into carnivore. I will say one more thing, like one of my friends who's in the triangle oxalate group and I'm friends with on Instagram, she was low oxalate for 7 years before she transitioned into carnivore and still started to dump at 8 years transitioning to carnivore and is still clearing oxalate. And I think it's best to listen to your body. And if you can't tolerate the dumping, you should probably add some oxalate in. If you're tough and it's not debilitating and you can handle some of that detox ups and downs, you can try to push it out and see how you do. But I don't know. I've just been pretty simple with, I guess, what I've done. I just eat and drink milk, no supplements. I don't work out, and I just try not to do things that are going to push me into too severe of a dump.
I think it's good practice. The main thing is I try to advocate for people is to try something out. If it doesn't work and you feel a detox reaction or you feel worse, then stop. The last thing I sort of wanted to touch on, Christi, before we tell folks where to find you online, and it was the anxiety side of things. I obviously, growing up, I was never anxious. I didn't have a dark sort of mood. Those last days and early days of the oxalate dumping for me, even after adding animal foods back in, because I was like you detoxing, were pretty scary because of the high anxiety, heart palpitations, and even depression. I've mentioned before in my chats that my doctor wanted to put me on antidepressants, but I was dumbfounded. I was like, but I've never been depressed. And clearly looking back that I was. And then I heard you say in the podcast that you did with Michael that anxiety is a detox symptom. And it really made sense to me. I'm like, that's so true, because when my anxiety really went through the roof is when I started doing those initial protocols when I was still vegan and my oxalate toxicity was high and I was really starting to move stuff out. And it's when I got super anxious, the palpitations started, and then going carnivore, as the dumping symptoms started, it sort of came back a little bit. But now, thank goodness, thank you, I am anxiety free for the most part and definitely feeling much better. Talk to us a little about that. How are you feeling these days in regards to that?
Well, it was good. Honestly, my first 2 years of carnivore, I didn't deal with any anxiety attacks. And I never did with Lyme, and I didn't really before. I always, looking back, felt like I kind of had a flat mood though. I struggled, I think, with sometimes being motivated, and I struggled with being excited about life. I think, like, I can look back and see that my mood was always sort of flat. I wasn't depressed. I didn't have anxiety disorders or anything like that, but I definitely think there was some brain toxicity that I was contending with. And then I would get some bouts of anxiety when I was treating and herxing from Lyme, for sure. And then, so that's how I know that it can be, I've always been able to say, okay, was this something I was dealing with? Like, is this something I was dealing with before I made this change, or was this something that came on from this change? Sometimes maybe that means the change is a bad thing, but sometimes there is that detox process and it does come with unpleasant symptoms. So for me, herxing would bring on anxiety, and I would get anxiety attacks. And the first 2 years of carnivore, I didn't necessarily feel euphoric like some people talk about, although I've had episodes of that for sure since going carnivore, but I didn't deal with anxiety or depression. I would say at about the 2-year mark, I noticed I was getting some anxiety attacks here and there. I would get some weird thoughts, and then I would get sort of like this low-grade depression that would come on. And I still feel like I contend with that on and off. It's not constant. I'm not constantly anxious, but I can always tell when I'm moving oxalate, because I will flare up some of that anxiety or just that depression or lack of, or gloom, or lack of motivation. You just feel very flat. You're not really excited about anything. Sally talks a lot about that. She's like, if you're clearing oxalate, you're going to deal with those kind of days where you just have a very low mood, or you're a little depressed, or you're anxious. So that came on for me later in the carnivore journey. And I do still contend with some of that, even some neuroses. Like, I had this weird neuroses, which I love the sun. I'll go stand in a tanning bed here and there. I love to lay out always, but I was like, my nervous system is shot somewhat, I think, from dumping. And I remember I walked out into the sun this past summer and like had a panic attack, because I don't know why, because it's just, and I've talked to other people who have dealt with some of that too, but it's like Sally talks about this weird neuroses where we just take things when we're dumping oxalate and we go to the extreme. Your foot hurts, you assume your leg's going to have to get cut off, or you're dying. That neurotoxicity causes us to be anxious and fearful and dread and go to the worst place. She talks about that a lot with patients and how they struggle with that when they're dumping. And I have seen that in my own experiences. Thankfully, it's not chronic and I don't want to get on medication, but I have had that on and off, especially as I've gotten farther in.
Christi, West, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. I really mean it, because the listeners should know it. I hope I'm not sharing, but you obviously shared on your own online already that you've been experiencing some dumping this weekend. So thank you for taking the time out. It is going to be so impactful and helpful for so many folks that are on the beginning stages like you and I, when we first found out about oxalates and going carnivore, and if there are challenges related to that, what happens, and especially for yourself, if someone that's coming from a Lyme diagnosis background that had that to deal with as well. So I want to say thank you. And where can folks go to connect with you online, Christi?
I'm mostly just on Instagram. I post, I don't do a ton of lives right now or anything, but Eat, Meet, and Live at Eat, Meet, and Live. So you can find me there. I just, put meat stuff up here and there, oxalate stuff. You can find me there. And that's about it.
You'll notice the name of this episode today is called Eat, Meet, and Live, specifically for Christi in honor of her. And I agree with that. We need to eat, meet, and live. And I am like you. I'm so thankful that I found this way of eating. There could be a lot worse ways to eat because it's so satiating and so nutritious, and it's just given me my health back. So for that, I'm eternally grateful. And like I said before, Christi, I'm grateful for you and taking the time out today. Thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thank you, James. You're the best.
Thank you, Christi. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks. You too.
And that's a wrap on this episode of Carnivorist Chats. If you've made it this far, I want to say thank you for listening, and also thank you in advance for liking, subscribing, or sharing this episode. Thanks again to Equip Foods, Carnivore Snacks, and the Carnivore Bar. Don't forget to check the link in the show notes to get a discount on their products. Until the next time, be well,